Welcome to Mrs. True Crime. Today's video is an in-depth look into the mystery of the unknown woman of Rahway, New Jersey. It's a tale of conspiracy and brutality. If you are triggered by anything dealing with death and or unanswered questions, feel free to click off this video. Perhaps check out a hamster video for some lighthearted content. If not, I'm Nicole. Let's get started. The year 1887 was a remarkable one, whether those knew it would be or not. On January 28th, construction began on the Eiffel Tower in Paris. On March 3rd, Anne Sullivan began teaching Helen Keller. And on April 4th, Susanna Madara Salter became the first female mayor in Argonia, Kansas, as well as the first woman elected to any political party in the United States. Though the year was met with a variety of achievements and historical events, there were disasters waiting in the distance. In Rahway, New Jersey, at approximately 9 p.m., a young woman was attacked, beaten, and stabbed. And though word of her murder reached across state lines, her identity has never been discovered. Even worse, her murderer has never been found. She was 5'2", blue-eyed and between 20 to 25 years of age. Her light brown hair was braided and tied around in a knot on the top of her head. Where she was walking to or from is uncertain, but what could be deduced was that she emerged on Central Avenue. Central Avenue, as described by author Alexander Shipley, was, quote, an avenue in name only. To either side of the stretch of road were open fields without even a single tree to grace the landscape, unquote. Though the road had been paved, rarely did a wagon or cart turn onto it. Running along the south side of the land was a fence, and along the stretch of fields were two homes. Despite its lack of mechanical action, people still frequented the road, either as a shortcut or a way onto St. George's, the main road. It's possible that the young woman was either walking away or toward the main road on Friday, March 25, 1887. Though spring was round in the corner, it was still cold and dry in New Jersey, especially at night. To keep warm, the young woman wore a dark green cashmere dress trimmed with green feathers, either yellow or brown kid gloves, as reports differ, foreign good shoes, a bonnet, a black straw hat with red velvet trimmings, a black dotted veil, and a fur cape. Reports contradicted the quality of her clothes. According to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, her clothes had been worn for some time and suffered from patches, whereas others say her clothing was in high quality. Her shoes were reportedly button gaiters of coarse leather and of German manufacturers. On her dress was a breastpin, while her hands housed 3 rings, a plain band, a chased ring, and another with 13 cheap red and white stones set in a long cloth setting. In her hand she carried an umbrella, a satchel, and possibly a willow basket filled with 10 eggs. The basket has been argued that it belonged to her assailant. Truthfully, no one knows what occurred next, but evidence concluded that while walking, the young woman was attacked from behind. Footprints showed that the young lady and her attacker entered the road upon different directions, though, according to Shipley, there were, quote, distinct footprints of more than one person could be seen coming from Jefferson Avenue. Only one set of prints returned in that direction, unquote. Prints in question belonged to a man's size 8 boot and was traced to a crowded thoroughfare before disappearing. It's possible he walked by her, turned, and attacked when she was still walking, or the two knew each other and were walking together. A struggle ensued. Physical evidence shows that the attacker beat the young woman until she fell to the ground. The coroner will find 3 bruises on her forehead and several more from her shoulders to her hands. Along with this were slashes on her hands. On her right hand was a slash near her wrist, and on the left was lacerated near her fingers, which, in my opinion, shows that she fought back. 2 cuts close together on her chin and a cut on her jaw were also examined, but it would be the long slit across her throat that stretched from ear to ear that would be her cause of death. Her clothing and other items she carried would be eventually torn and or tossed about around her. She laid on her side with her head pressed to the ground and covered in mud. A man's heel close to her head would be found. Under her body was a, quote, Norfolk number 16 collar with the letter N sewed in the middle with gold thread, unquote. Her satchel will be taken and tossed into the nearby river, and her attacker would run into the night, never to be caught. Approximately 9 hours later, at 6:15 a.m., brothers Alfred, Tom, and Irving Worth ventured to Blood Goods Mill with Alfred a bit ahead. This is where Alfred saw the woman's body. He noted that she lay next to the fence, frozen in time. Her face was covered in blood and mud, and her clothes were disarranged. Her dress was muddy and partially up to her knees. He also noted the large slash mark across her throat. Around her were her items. Her fur cape was torn, and her eggs were broken. Wagon wheel tracks were visible on the road. Alfred called to his brothers. Tom instructed Alfred to get Chief William Tooker. Irving was ordered to go to the mill and tell the foreman, while Tom stayed and guarded the crime scene. Frank Worth ran into Alfred and accompanied his younger brother to the chief's residence. They arrived at 6:45. Word quickly spread among the citizens of the small town. The crime scene was no longer safeguarded by a Worth. It was now overpopulated with those trying to get a glimpse of the body or taking it upon themselves to search for clues. While their eagerness didn't go unnoticed, it also corrupted the crime scene and potentially tampered evidence. Tooker informed a nearby policeman to assist in keeping people back as he ventured to call the coroner. Upon his return, he met with former Chief George Wright and Sergeant George Conger. Wright carried a black satchel that he said had been pulled from the river past the Jefferson Avenue Bridge. The satchel had to be twisted with a knife in order to unlock. Inside, the three men discovered different forms of women's clothing: a chemise, which is a little worn, a fur net comforter, 2 white aprons, black and white buckle, a plaid skirt, a new chemise, a new nightgown, a green velvet sack with lace sleeves and orange buttons down the front, and a pair of slippers. There was also a section of the New York Herald dated March 23, 1887, a comb and brush, 1 pair of scissors, and half a pair of suspenders. At the bottom was a handkerchief with the name K.M. Norrie, or Norrs, and a rubber stamp with the name Timothy Byrne. As the police searched what they assumed to be the young woman's possessions, Citizen Benjamin Metzer handed a bloodied penknife to Tooker. Benjamin said he discovered it about 20 yards from the body. The penknife was approximately 2.5 inches long with a turquoise handle. Dr. P.N. Burged and a reporter claimed to have seen what they suspected to be blood on the Jefferson Avenue Bridge. The doctor opinionated it was human blood. From here, Coroner Dr. Thomas Terrell of Elizabeth arrived with his team, later including Detective John Caron, and they got to work preserving and taking as many photos of the body and crime scene as possible. They rounded up 12, quote, good and lawful men, unquote, for an inquest that would be heard the following week. Now the investigation began. The biggest issue about the murder was that in the small town, no one seemed to know who the woman was, but many said they witnessed her in one way or another. According to 2 men and several girls, they saw a woman the day before carrying a satchel on the outskirts of town. Others reported seeing tramps, quote, a person who travels from place to place on foot in search of work or as a vagrant or beggar, unquote, hanging around outside Rahway the last few days. Police Justice Jeremiah Tunzen said he saw the deceased on Main Street Thursday and again on Friday, while Mrs. Jacob Moore says she heard screams around 10 Friday night. Seeing as detectives still had no idea who she was, all statements were taken into consideration. The young woman was eventually taken away and an autopsy was performed. The results showed that she wasn't sexually assaulted, nor pregnant, though her, quote, virtue, unquote, was in question. The autopsy also showed she suffered blows to the forehead with a blunt object. Her feet were blistered in several places, and the heels of her stockings were completely worn, which a doctor concluded that she'd walked around the country for at least 2 months. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle mentioned that the young woman suffered from poor hygiene. Based on her features, they believed she was Scandinavian, Irish, and German. Hoping to identify the deceased, the police presented her for viewing at the local morgue. A reward of $500 was declared by the mayor, $200 for the ID of the girl, and $300 for her killer. Whether to collect the reward or cure their curiosity, thousands piled to the small building to get a glimpse of her. She was dressed in white, in a coffin, with only her face and shoulders showing through a plate of glass. 2 policemen stood by the coffin and watched the crowd. Most sobbed while others sighed, either out of relief or sadness is hard to say. One man viewed the body, then ran screaming down the street. The police followed. The man ran to an inn, where he was encompassed by police and reporters alike. He sat with his head buried in his hands, mumbling to himself. His name was George Washington Gregory, and he was soon taken to the station, where he refused to give any concrete answers. Instead, he talked in riddles, saying, quote, "If I murdered the girl, and you can prove it, all right," unquote. Annoyed, the police illegally searched him, finding a watch, a revolver, $17, a knife, a guide to the national capital, and a personal letter from Warwick, New York, with a message about a problem with a woman. George continued to refuse questions and was thrown in jail. After a few days, he confessed that it was only the sight of the deceased that made him scream, and that he was at E.B. Adams' farm the night of the murder. Unfortunately for the police, his alibi checked out, but he wouldn't be the last to be accused. William Brunt and his son Willie stated that they saw a girl who looked like the deceased hanging clothes in the yard of Clinton Froat on Friday morning. On Saturday, Willie claimed to see the Froats get in a wagon and drive out of town. Clinton and his relative William Keach lived near the corner of Maple and Jefferson, which, if I map correctly, is approximately 7 minutes on foot away from the crime scene. Clinton was new to the section, and was said to be tough and lazy, though an avid cheater holding wild parties into the night. His relative William Keach was a brute with one eye who carried a club. Rumors swirled that he was a thief and his wife was in prison, though the newspapers will report that no one in the family ever viewed the body or went to the crime scene. Many in the small town would insist the Froats were to blame. They were too close to the crime scene, had connection to foreign women, and were reclusive. To the town of Rahway, that meant they were guilty. Chief Tooker went to the residence, discovering that Clinton, William, Clinton's wife, and a woman named Nancy left for Westfield and wouldn't return until night. According to Clinton's stepson, Nancy was Irish and had just moved to the country. Tooker and Detective Karen searched for the family and found all 4 in a wagon, heading from Westfield. They checked inside the car and found Nancy, who wore her hair like the deceased woman. Police felt they weren't the killers, but they wouldn't stop the town from pointing fingers. William Brunt lived about 40 yards from the Froats, and according to his inquest, around 8 p.m. on the night of the murder, he met up with his sons at Baker's Corner. His sons stated they saw Keach walking up and down the streets with a club. Brunt said that he saw Keach, and though he didn't see a club, he heard the sounds of one. Still, nothing could be proved that Keach or Clinton killed the unidentified girl. 7 months later, Clinton's own daughter would accuse her father of the crime, but her testimony would prove false. 2 years later, a 16-year-old Mamie Hughes accused Clinton's nephew, William Froat, of kidnapping and the murder. She claimed she was held captive for 5 weeks and was asked for her hand in marriage. When she refused, William alluded to the murder of the young Rahway woman at his hands. When arrested, William and his parents were with a young woman. The young woman was 16-year-old Katie Ellis, whose story mirrored Mamie's. According to the Sun, Katie, quote, cried with joy when the detectives arrested the Froats, unquote. William confessed to keeping a young German girl for a time, and that he took her to New Brunswick, but that was the last he ever saw her. On their property, police found an arsenal of weapons and chickens, both of which were added into evidence. Yet, it was all circumstantial, and William was soon released. In 1894, Margaret Grace claimed that she met the young woman the afternoon before the body was found. She says the young woman was Ellen Mayer, and that she was from Ireland and was looking to go west and start her life over. Margaret met Ellen when she delivered milk to the Froats. The two had a lovely conversation, according to Margaret, and she was shocked when she saw Ellen again in the morgue. Fear of being the next victim, Margaret said nothing until 7 years later, when William and Clinton had moved towns. By this time, the authorities had little interest in the story. In June, Caspar Schumbeck confessed to the crime. He was arrested and wrote down his confession, but it was later determined that he lied. The New York Times ran an article sometime after the murder, claiming that the handkerchief didn't belong to the victim. The article describes the clothing found in the satchel, noting that many of the garments couldn't have fit her. The one thing that could have fit her was the green velvet sack, but that was the way of the newspapers. Many of them had their theories. One theory was that the motive was sexual assault. The girl came to the area looking for a place to sleep, but was lost. She reaches the town at the same time as the killer, carrying eggs. She asks for directions. They speak. He insists he can take her to her destination, but instead takes her to Central Avenue, where she rejects him. Enraged, he insults her, only for her to run and be tackled by him later. The two struggle. He drags her to the fence and strikes her twice with a fence post. Lying unconscious, he slits her throat, then throws the knife, grabs her bag, and runs. He fumbles opening the bag, then throws it into the river. The second theory's motive was robbery. This theory plays much like the first, but there wasn't any sexual assault. The last theory believes it was premeditated. They are both from New York, where the killer lured her to Rahway and killed her after deliberate planning. These theories did raise more questions into who the woman was. Reporters and investigators contacted employment agencies to find names of women who may have been sent to Rahway. They searched the records at Castle Gardens, a converted immigrant processing depot where they would register, have their money exchanged, and get information for housing and trains. By the time of the young woman's murder, 8 million people had gone through the depot. They searched for any matches of K.M. Norrie, but came up empty. Investigators even checked nearby brothels, believing the young woman may have been a sex worker based on her dress, but that too was a dead end. Yet, much like those that were charged with her murder, others claimed her body, only to be declared wrong. Robert Nehmeyer claimed the girl was her daughter Mary, who was 19 with light hair, face and hands covered in smallpox, a scar on her neck, and a dimple on her chin. Unfortunately, that did not describe the deceased. Simon Etchhorn claimed the girl was his wife's 22-year-old missing cousin Clara Link. Clara had been in the country for 2 years and was living with her cousin until she left to work in a domestic hotel as Mary. Though Simon gave a positive ID of the deceased as Clara, he could not recognize her clothing. There was another woman by the name of Clara Wilson, who authorities believed may be the deceased girl. She applied for housing, but left early the morning the young woman was killed. Clara was 24, wore a watch and chain, and had a small willow basket. She also had short hair. She spoke with an English accent and had little money. It was never determined if the young woman was in fact Clara Wilson. Lastly, Jane Harris claimed the woman was her sister Mary Dorman, who she believed was killed by her brother-in-law. Though the undertaker mentioned how closely the deceased resembled Jane and her other sister Agnes, there were a few discrepancies. For one, Mary Dorman had given birth. The deceased had not. Secondly, their mother received word that Mary was alive, though it was written by Mary's husband. Still, the family and even the undertaker believed she was Mary Dorman, despite the investigators' doubts. As for the Timothy Byrne, the name on the rubber stamp, that too was a dead end. One man claimed to be Mr. Byrne at a bar, only to be revealed as a fraud. Investigators found that the stamp was ordered a year before the murder by an agent named Liverpool. Liverpool described Mr. Byrne as, quote, a solidly built man, about 6 feet tall, with light brown hair and a mustache, unquote. He went on that he was well dressed, had a gruff voice, and smelled of alcohol. Searching bars and other places turned up nothing. The, quote, 12 lawful and good men, unquote, met on 4 different occasions in hopes of learning new information. They met with medical examiners, officers, and other witnesses to uncover the mystery. Juryman Mark Keefe testified that he'd seen the willow basket in Baker's grocery store about a month or so before the murder, though clerk Billy Burns said otherwise. The basket, according to Shipley, was in the shape of half an egg and was well worn. The 36 stitches on the cover showcased that it was repaired often. There were a few small pieces of red onion peelings and grains of oats clinging to the inside. If the basket belonged to the young woman, no one came forward to say so, nor did anyone come forward in saying she purchased eggs from them. Photos of the deceased made their rounds at the 1887 Chicago World's Fair and in the April 1887 Police Gazette. For 25 years, Chief Tucker's wife showcased the young woman's clothes, hoping for a positive ID, but in 1920 gave them back to local police. The mystery of the young woman was blamed heavily on the investigation, according to the New York Daily. They complained that the murderer was a local and that he could have easily slipped away and gotten rid of the evidence. The Daily was frustrated that police didn't do any home searches, nor did they secure the crime scene effectively. They also said that the, quote, screening process before anyone could see the body and not allowing the general public to view remains was unproductive, unquote. On April 11th, the unknown woman was carried by 6 New York reporters to First Presbyterian Church and was given a funeral service by Reverend Walter Alfred Gay. Her casket was oak and covered in satin. On the side was a silver plate with the words, "Died March 25th, 1887. Cruelly slain, a woman and a stranger, aged about 25 years old." Her grave was dug at a distance from family plots and was paid for by the people of Rahway. No one may ever find out who this young woman was, and though her last moments were met with brutality, her memory lived on in the minds and hearts of those who wanted so desperately to bring her home. I'm Mrs. True Crime, and remember to be kind, be loud, be aware. For more information about the unknown woman of Rahway, why not check out some of these awesome links? And if you like what you saw and heard today, why not drop a like and a comment? Maybe subscribe while you're here. I make new videos every Wednesday, and you don't want to miss what's in store.